the grey Palfrey. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, life in Europe became a little less grim. The scourge of the Black Death had come and gone. Large national groupings were emerging to form the countries we know today. In the new security of a large kingdom, persistent local warfare suddenly seemed old-fashioned. At last, there was time to think of more than basic survival. The young folk began to suggest there should be more to marriage than property contracts. There was talk of love and happiness. In France, there began to be told the romantic tales, which were the forerunners of our modern worlds. Long ago, in the Champagne region of France, there lived a handsome young knight. He was brave and strong, but he was not wealthy. He owned but a small manor house and a few fields that were set deep in a forest away from the highways. Poor though he was, the young knight had one possession which was the envy of the district. He owned a fine grey palfrey. This pretty riding horse was the finest limbed and the best trained creature ever seen in the realm. Many noblemen, richer than the young knight, offered to buy the grey palfrey, but he would not part with it. "I trained it, and it is mine to serve me and to be my friend," he said, with more truth than he realized. Being of noble birth, the poor knight took part in the social gatherings at the great aristocratic houses of Champagne. Everyone knew and liked him, but as he was blessed with few of this world's goods, he was regarded as of no importance. At dinner he was seated far away from the grand folk at the head of the table. No mother put him on the list of desirable husbands for her daughter. However, the handsome face of the brave young knight caught the eye of the daughter of a great duke. She fell in love with him, and he with her. They met in secret, but they knew their love was hopeless. The maiden was aware that her father would arrange for her to marry a wealthy man. The brave knight knew that without rich property he could never ask for the hand in marriage of the daughter of a duke. Fortunately for the young couple, the home of the duke was in the forest not far from the young knight's manor house. Whenever he could, the knight rode through narrow forest paths known only to him, and came to the walls of the duke's great house. At a little barred grating hidden amongst bushes, he would wait for his beloved. Whenever she could, the maiden slipped away to talk to her knight, and he always waited. If the maiden came to him and whispered words of love and touched his hand through the opening in the wall, he rode home singing with happiness. If he waited at the wall in vain, while the lovely maiden stayed in the house, unable to slip away to join him, then the poor knight rode back through the forest filled with misery. Tears would run down his cheeks as he slumped in the saddle of the grey palfrey, scarcely noticing whither he went. Several years passed in this manner, for the knight and the maiden were both young. The knight began to wonder if, after all, he might dare to ask the Duke for the hand of his daughter. The knight was brave and fearless, and as he grew to the full strength of his manhood, he achieved more and more success at the great tournaments. In those days, all young men of noble blood were expected to learn to be skillful fighters. Mock battles called tournaments were regularly held, the winners of the combats taking the armor and horses of their opponents. These trophies could be of considerable value, and after several victories, the young knight was able to set some coffers of gold in his strong room. I am not rich, but now I am not poor. My house and lands are small, but they feed me and clothe me, and my family is of noble blood, and I am a skilled soldier. Surely the Duke could welcome me as a son-in-law, he thought. Wearing his finest clothes, he rode the grey Palfrey to the house of the Duke and asked to speak with the great man. The Duke agreed to see him, for the young knight had been known to him since boyhood. The knight bowed. Your Grace, he said, you see before you a skilled soldier and an honest man able to manage men and estates. You see a man fit to be a member of your household. I have a request to ask of you. The Duke looked at the knight in astonishment. Surely you are not asking for employment, he said. Nobles do not work. They fight and live from the produce of their property. You know that. The young knight smiled. Indeed I do. I am not seeking employment. I am endeavoring to persuade you that I am a fit man to marry your daughter. Long have I loved her. Long has she loved me. Our feelings will never change. Will you give me your daughter's hand in marriage? The Duke looked and laughed until the tears ran down his cheeks. Have you taken leave of your senses? He asked. My daughter will inherit my vast property. She must marry a man equally rich. I will not waste her on a boy with a few bags of gold in his paltry manor house. Then the Duke smiled at the young man in a kindly way, for he had known him since he had been a child. Go home and forget such foolish dreams, he said. Busy yourself at your tournaments. One day you will find the daughter of another poor nobleman, living in a manor house the like of yours, and she will suit you very well. The young knight turned away with a heavy heart. He rode his grey palfrey home through the secret narrow paths of his forest. The next day he set off for a tournament in a far-off part of France. If I win enough tournaments, then one day perhaps the Duke might relent, he thought. The young knight was away from Champagne for many weeks, and during that time an old friend of the Duke's came a-visiting. This man was as old and grey-haired as the Duke himself, and both were avaricious by nature. The friend looked with envy at the fine home and rich lands of the Duke, for although he had much, he still wanted more. The old comrade sat talking of days gone by, and of long dead men and women whose faces would never smile at them again. "Ah, how I miss my wife," sighed the friend. "Being left a widower is a lonely fate." Then the Duke looked at his friend and said, "I am a wealthy man, and you are a wealthy man. Joined together, we should be richer than anyone else in France. If you were to marry my daughter, we could manage our affairs to our mutual benefit. No one would be more powerful than we two combined." His friend liked the Duke's suggestion. "With such an arrangement, I would marry your daughter without asking for a dowry," he smiled. "The joint management of our properties would bring me wealth enough." Then when he heard those words, the Duke had no more doubts. "Let us make arrangements for the marriage to take place as soon as possible," he said. When the young maiden heard that she was to marry her father's gray-haired old friend, she was heartbroken. She begged the Duke not to make her do such a thing. If I may not marry my beloved young knight, who lives in his manor house in the forest, at least let me wed a young man, fit to live with a young woman," she pleaded. "Do not tie me to a wrinkled old miser." The Duke brushed her pleas aside. "I brought you up so that you could make a marriage to improve our family fortunes," he said. "This is the richest offer we shall ever have. Do your duty and behave as a noblewoman should. Do not burden my ears with talk of happiness." The young maiden returned to her room. She prepared a beautiful dress for her wedding day, and she wept. The Duke sent out invitations to his closest friends and to guests at the wedding. He summoned his steward and his master of the horse to stand before him. He gave the steward orders for food and for the preparation of chambers. He turned to the master of his horses. "My daughter should ride to our wedding on a quiet, well-behaved mount," he said. "One with a fine appearance, which will be the envy of those who behold her." "In that case," replied the master of horse, "there's only one horse for her to ride, and that is the grey Palfrey belonging to the young knight who lives in the forest to the west." "Of course," smiled the Duke. "That grey Palfrey is the very mount. Send to the young knight and ask him to lend me the horse on the day before the wedding. I will return it to him well cared for, the day after the ceremony." The Duke did not give a thought for the feelings of the young knight. Great noblemen expected lesser nobles to oblige them with the services and goods. That was the way of the world. The servant of the Duke came to the manor house of the young knight as he was returning triumphant from the great tournament. The servant asked if the Duke could borrow the palfrey for 3 days during the coming week. "Of course," replied the young knight. "She will be rested by then." He was glad to do a favor to ingratiate himself with the father of his beloved. From idle curiosity he added, "Why does the Duke need my horse next week? Is he going on a journey?" "No," smiled the servant. "The horse is needed for the wedding of the Duke's daughter. She will ride the grey palfrey to the church, where she will marry the Duke's old friend. Everything is arranged for the two great estates to be joined together." The young man stood still, and his heart turned cold. His beloved was to marry someone else. He would never know another happy hour. For a few moments he considered refusing to lend the grey palfrey. Why should he do anything to help this unwelcome marriage? Then he thought, "The Duke's daughter cannot wish to marry this old man. If I send her my horse, perhaps that will be a little comfort to her. In the midst of her unhappiness, she will have something of mine to remind her that we are at least united in our sorrow." The next week the knight sent his horse to the home of the Duke on the day before the wedding. Then the young man shut himself in his bedchamber and would speak to no one. He sat staring from the window. Meanwhile, the wedding guests had arrived at the home of the Duke. The evening before the ceremony, they had all dined merrily together. They laughed and toasted the bridegroom and the Duke and congratulated them on their splendid alliance. They sat up late, drinking of the free wine, and stumbled to their beds scarcely an hour before they were due to rise. The fair maiden also spent a sleepless night, but she did not pass her hours in jollity. Like the young knight, she sat staring from the window of her bedchamber. She thought of her grey-haired old bridegroom, with his wrinkled skin, her own young face set into lines of unhappiness. The next morning, before dawn, the steward went round the house, hammering on the doors and calling the guests to awake and mount their horses. "It is a long ride to the church," he called. "We must start betimes." Groaning and clutching their aching heads, the Duke and the bridegroom and their friends staggered from their beds. In the half-light they dragged on their rich clothes and groped their way up to their saddles. Two by two they jangled along the narrow forest road, keeping their heads down to avoid the sweeping branches of the overhanging trees. The Duke and the bridegroom rode at the head of the procession, and the maiden at the rear, in the care of the steward. The girl wore her lovely dress, but her eyes were blinded with tears. The steward, who had been up all night, dozed in his saddle. So this bleary-eyed, belching company swayed through the forest in the dim grey light which shines before dawn. No one noticed when, from force of habit, the grey palfrey turned down the secret path which was usually taken by the young knight. The maiden sat in the saddle, cold and exhausted, and did not raise her head to look about her. Suddenly she wondered why the rest of the company had fallen so silent. Then she saw that she was alone in the wilds of the forest on a narrow path leading she knew not whither. Terror seized her, and she opened her mouth to call the steward. Then she closed her mouth and thought, "I would rather be killed by the wild beasts than go to the church to marry that old man. Let the grey palfrey carry me where it will." Back on the main track through the forest, the steward opened his eyes to see that the maiden no longer rode at his side. He thought she had gone ahead to be with her father, and with a grunt he went back to his snoozing. The sun came up above the horizon. It cleared the tops of the trees and shone down through the leaves. The grey palfrey tossed its head and hurried along the paths it had trod so many times with the young knight. Scenting home, the Palfrey cantered across the last few yards of cleared land and snorted before the door of the knight's manor house. The watchman pushed open a grille high in the wall and looked out. "Who is there?" he called. The maiden was fearful that she had come to the den of bandits. However, she had little choice but to reply. "I am lost in the forest. Please let me rest for a while, and then show me the way to my home," she called. By this time the watchman had recognized the grey palfrey. He ran the room of his master and hammered at the door. "Your grey palfrey is at the gate, with a maiden as beautiful as the sun, riding on its back," he shouted. The young knight ran to the door and flung it open. Sitting on his grey palfrey, he saw the maiden he loved. She stared at him in astonishment. He led her in through the gates, which were slammed shut after her. The maiden slid from the horse into the arms of the brave young knight. "How did you get here?" he asked. I don't know, she sobbed and laughed together. My eyes were blinded by tears. Somehow the grey palfrey turned away from the track and from the wedding guests, and brought me here. "Then here you shall stay," said the brave young knight. "Our love was meant to be." He woke his chaplain and called his household together. In front of them all the young knight and maiden were married. When the duke and the bridegroom arrived at the church, they turned to wait for the maiden, while the whole company of groaning, sleepy guests dismounted from their horses. The steward arrived, but there was no bride. What uproar and recriminations were there! What shouting and mounting and dismounting of horses! The duke and his guests and servants searched back through the forest and through the duke's large home. By that time they came to the manor house of the young knight. The wedding was over. The couple were man and wife, and what was done could not be undone. The duke stamped with rage. Then, seeing there was no remedy, he gave the couple his blessing and left. The young knight and the fair maiden lived the rest of their lives in happiness.